The quiet hum of a late-night diner was interrupted by the faint sound of sirens wailing in the distance. Marcus Carter sat in a corner booth, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as he glanced at his watch. He wasn't here by chance. This meeting had been weeks in the making. For months, Marcus had been investigating a string of complaints in the small southern town of Ridgewood. What started as whispers of corruption had turned into a steady stream of stories, each more shocking than the last. Families had been evicted without notice, businesses fined into bankruptcy, and lives ruined, all by the hands of those who had sworn to serve and protect. Marcus, a civil rights attorney for the Department of Justice, had seen his fair share of injustice. But this was different. The stories painted a chilling picture of a local police force that operated more like an organized crime syndicate than a department bound by law. Tonight, Marcus wasn't just in Ridgewood to gather information. He was here to confront the very people responsible. The diner door swung open, and in walked two officers. Their uniforms, while neatly pressed, carried an air of authority that felt more threatening than reassuring. Officers Brad Mathers and Paul Sims were well known in Ridgewood, not for their heroism, but for their iron grip on the community. They exchanged a glance, their smirks widening as they spotted Marcus sitting alone. Well, Brad drawled as they approached, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads in the nearly empty diner. "What do we have here?" "Outsiders don't usually last long in Ridgewood. You lost, buddy." Marcus remained calm, his gaze steady as he gestured to the empty seats across from him. "I was actually hoping to have a word with you both." Paul chuckled, sliding into the booth across from Marcus while Brad stood, his arms crossed. "You're not from around here, are you? Let me guess. You're one of those big city lawyers who think they can waltz into our town and tell us how to do our job." "I'm not here to tell you how to do your job," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm here because a lot of people seem to think you aren't doing it at all." Brad's expression darkened. "Careful, friend. You don't want to throw around accusations without proof. This town doesn't take kindly to troublemakers." Paul leaned forward, his grin sharp. "And if you're smart, you'll take your coffee and head back to wherever it is you came from. Ridgewood's not a place for people like you to stir the pot." Marcus felt the weight of their words, the thinly veiled threat hanging in the air, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward Paul. "This is a list of every complaint filed against your department in the last year. Excessive force, illegal search and seizure, harassment, extortion. The list goes on." Brad snorted, flipping through the papers without much interest. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this? Write a sternly worded letter." Paul laughed, shoving the folder back toward Marcus. "Save yourself the trouble, buddy. You're out of your depth here." For a moment, Marcus said nothing. He took a sip of his coffee, his calm demeanor unshaken. Then slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather badge holder. He flicked it open, revealing the gleaming emblem of the United States Department of Justice. The officer's laughter died instantly. Brad's smirk faltered as his eyes locked onto the badge, realization dawning. Paul leaned back, his bravado slipping into unease. "Let me be clear," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I'm not some random lawyer. I'm here on behalf of the DOJ, and I think it's time we had a serious conversation about how you're running things in Ridgewood." The tension at the table was palpable, the officers now caught between their usual arrogance and the sinking realization of who they were dealing with. But before they could respond, the diner door swung open again, and a shadowy figure stepped inside. Marcus' eyes flicked toward the newcomer, his instincts immediately on high alert. The story was far from over, and Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The diner fell silent as the shadowy figure stepped through the doorway. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of quiet authority that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room. His dark jacket was unzipped just enough to reveal a sheriff's badge glinting against his chest. He was Sheriff Dale Hudson, the man who had been running Ridgewood for over a decade. "Evening, gentlemen," Sheriff Hudson said, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the tension. He took a slow look around the room, his piercing eyes finally landing on Marcus. His expression didn't betray much, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his gaze as he approached the booth. Brad and Paul immediately straightened in their seats, their casual arrogance shifting to something closer to respect or fear. They slid out of the booth as Hudson reached the table, making room for the sheriff to sit directly across from Marcus. "I hear we've got a visitor," Hudson said, his tone calm but laced with something hard to pin down. He nodded toward Marcus, his hand resting on the table. Mind telling me what brings you to Ridgewood this time of night? Marcus met Hudson's gaze, his calm unbroken. Just grabbing a cup of coffee and having a conversation with your officers here, he said, motioning to the seats Brad and Paul had vacated. Hudson's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, I hope they've been good company, he said smoothly, his tone carrying a weight that suggested it wasn't really a question. Brad cleared his throat, stepping forward. He's from the DOJ, he muttered, his earlier bravado now completely gone. Hudson's eyes flicked to Marcus's badge, still lying open on the table. He didn't reach for it, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. That's quite the badge, he said after a pause, and quite the accusation you've made, coming all the way out here. I haven't made any accusations yet, Marcus replied, his voice even. But I've seen enough to know that something's very wrong in this town. People are scared. Families are being torn apart. And every trail I've followed leads back to this department. Hudson leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. People talk, he said, shrugging slightly. Doesn't make it true. Small towns like Ridgewood have a way of exaggerating things. Folks don't always understand how the system works, and sometimes they just need someone to blame. Maybe, Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Hudson's. But I've got more than stories. I've got evidence. Witnesses. Names. The sheriff's smile faltered for a split second before returning, though it was noticeably tighter now. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. And what exactly do you plan to do with all that, Mr. Carter? Drag this town through the mud? Tear apart a community that's already struggling to survive? I plan to do my job, Marcus said firmly, which is to ensure that the law is followed and that justice is served. If that means shining a light on things people would rather keep hidden, so be it. Hudson's gaze lingered on Marcus for a long moment. The room was so quiet now that the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed deafening. Finally, the sheriff leaned back again, a faint chuckle escaping his lips. You're a brave man, I'll give you that, he said. Coming here alone, flashing that badge around like it's a shield. But you don't know Ridgewood. You don't know how things work here. You think you're dealing with black and white, right and wrong. But this town, it's a shade of gray you've never seen before. Before Marcus could respond, the waitress, who had been hovering nervously near the counter, approached the table with a pot of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured a refill into Marcus' cup. She didn't say a word, her eyes darting between the sheriff and the DOJ badge on the table. Thanks, Marcus said softly, offering her a small, reassuring smile. The woman hesitated for a moment, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something, but then she quickly turned and hurried back to the counter. Hudson's gaze followed her retreating figure before returning to Marcus. You see that? He asked, gesturing subtly toward the waitress. That's what I'm talking about. Fear. People like her, they're just trying to get by. They don't want trouble. And all your digging, all your accusations, that's all it's going to bring. Trouble. Or maybe it'll bring accountability, Marcus countered. Hudson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood slowly, smoothing out the front of his jacket. I think it's time you head back to wherever you came from, Mr. Carter, he said. Ridgewood doesn't need saving. And it sure doesn't need a hero. He motioned for Brad and Paul to follow him, and the two officers hurried to obey, their earlier cockiness completely replaced by deference. Hudson paused at the door, glancing back at Marcus one last time. Enjoy your coffee, he said. It might be your last peaceful moment in this town. With that, he walked out, the officers trailing behind him. Marcus sat there for a moment, letting their words settle. He wasn't intimidated, but he wasn't naive either. Ridgewood was clearly a town with deep secrets, and the people who ran it weren't going to give them up without a fight. He glanced toward the counter, where the waitress was nervously wiping down an already clean surface. Something about her hesitation earlier had stuck with him. She knew something. He was sure of it. Marcus stood and walked over to the counter, his voice low as he addressed her. You're afraid of them, aren't you? The waitress froze, her eyes wide. She glanced around the empty diner before leaning in slightly. You don't understand, she whispered. This town, they control everything. The police, the courts, even the businesses. If you stand up to them, they'll destroy you. That's why I'm here, Marcus said gently, to stop them from hurting people like you. She shook her head, her voice trembling. They'll come after you too. They don't care who you are or what badge you carry. You need to leave, before it's too late. Marcus met her fearful gaze, a mixture of determination and unease settling in his chest. I can't leave, he said. Not until I've done what I came here to do. The waitress hesitated for a moment, then glanced toward the window. Outside, the flashing lights of a police cruiser illuminated the parking lot. They're watching you, she whispered. "Be careful." Marcus nodded, his mind racing as he made his way back to his booth. He picked up his badge and tucked it back into his pocket, his resolve hardening. Ridgewood might be a town of secrets, but he was here to uncover every last one of them, no matter the cost. Marcus sat in his car, the diner's neon sign flickering in the rearview mirror. His fingers tapped lightly on the steering wheel as he thought about the waitress's warning. Her fear wasn't subtle, it was written in the tremor of her voice, the way her eyes darted around as if she expected someone to be watching. People like her were why Marcus took this job in the first place. The flashing police lights that had briefly lit up the parking lot were gone now, but he could feel their presence lingering in the air. Ridgewood's law enforcement wasn't just corrupt. They were organized, methodical, and unafraid to flex their power. Sheriff Hudson hadn't needed to say it outright. Marcus understood the message loud and clear. Leave or you'll regret it. But regret wasn't something Marcus allowed to guide his decisions. He pulled out his phone and opened a secure app, typing a quick message to his DOJ contact. Confirms suspicions. Local enforcement, deeply entrenched, will dig further. He hit send and leaned back in his seat, staring out into the dark streets of the quiet town. Somewhere in this place were the answers he needed. He just had to find them. As he drove through Ridgewood, Marcus noticed how lifeless the streets felt. Houses had their curtains drawn tight, and the few people he saw walking hurried along with their heads down. There was no community here, only fear. It was as though the entire town had collectively decided that blending into the background was the safest option. Marcus decided to drive by the courthouse, a looming colonial-style building near the center of town. Even in the dark, it looked imposing, its massive stone columns casting long shadows. He parked across the street and studied it. A few lights were on inside, but the building looked otherwise deserted. Something about it seemed off, too pristine, almost untouched by the kind of wear and tear he expected from a small-town institution. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air brushing against his face. He crossed the street slowly, his shoes crunching against the gravel in the otherwise silent night. As he approached the courthouse steps, the hair on the back of his neck prickled. He paused, glancing around, but the street was empty. Marcus pushed the feeling aside and climbed the steps, trying the main door. Locked, as he'd expected. He reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving a small flashlight. He swept the beam across the doorframe, looking for any signs of tampering or unusual marks. Nothing. Looking for something. A voice called out from the darkness behind him. Marcus spun around, the flashlight illuminating the figure leaning casually against a lamppost. It was a man, probably in his early 40s, with a rugged, weathered face and a cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. Just taking in the architecture, Marcus replied evenly, lowering the flashlight. The man chuckled, the sound low and gravelly. He stepped forward into the light, revealing a mechanic's jumpsuit with the name Eddie stitched across the chest. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "No, I'm not," Marcus said. Eddie took a drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "People who go poking around where they don't belong don't usually stay long in Ridgewood," he said, his words carrying a hint of warning. "That's supposed to scare me?" Marcus asked, his gaze steady. "Not trying to scare you," Eddie said, shrugging. "Just telling you how things work around here." Marcus studied the man for a moment, trying to gauge his intentions. Eddie didn't seem hostile, but there was an edge to him, a weariness that suggested he'd seen his fair share of Ridgewood's darker side. "Let me guess," Marcus said. "You're not just here for a late-night stroll." Eddie smirked, tossing his cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his boot. "Let's just say I've got a habit of keeping an eye on things. And you stick out like a sore thumb." "I'm here to do a job," Marcus said simply. Eddie nodded slowly. "Yeah, I figured as much. Word travels fast in a place like this. Sheriff Hudson doesn't like outsiders, especially ones with badges like yours." "Does that bother you?" Marcus asked, his tone probing. Eddie hesitated, his smirk fading. He glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one else was watching. "If you're smart, you'll get whatever it is you came for and get out. This town chews people up and spits them out. Doesn't matter how tough you think you are." "Maybe I'm not the one who should be scared," Marcus replied. Eddie's expression hardened slightly, and he took a step closer. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low. "This isn't just about the sheriff or a few bad cops. It's bigger than that. Ridgewood's got roots. Deep ones, and pulling on them could bring the whole thing down on your head." Marcus didn't flinch. "Maybe it's time for those roots to be exposed." Eddie stared at him for a long moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "You're either brave or stupid," he said, "probably both." He started to turn away, then paused. If you're dead set on sticking around, you might want to pay a visit to Old Mill Road. There's a house out there, abandoned. Also, they say. Why? Marcus asked. Eddie didn't answer. He just gave Marcus a long, unreadable look before walking off into the night, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Marcus watched him go, his mind racing. Old Mill Road. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a lead. He glanced back at the courthouse one last time before heading to his car. As he drove toward Old Mill Road, the sense of unease from earlier crept back in. The town seemed to close in around him, the streets narrowing, the shadows growing longer. Ridgewood wasn't just hiding secrets. It was alive with them, pulsing with an energy that made the air feel thick and oppressive. When Marcus finally reached the turnoff for Old Mill Road, he hesitated for a moment before steering onto the gravel path. Trees lined both sides of the road, their gnarled branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of the road ahead. The house appeared suddenly, its silhouette looming against the night sky. It was old, its paint peeling and windows boarded up, but something about it felt wrong, like it was watching him. Marcus parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. He approached the house cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he stepped into the entryway. The house was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that seemed to press in on all sides. Marcus moved slowly, his footsteps muffled by the layers of dust on the floor. As he explored, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. And then, just as he reached what appeared to be the living room, he saw it, carved into the wall. A series of marks, symbols, scratched deep into the wood. They were crude but deliberate, arranged in a pattern that sent a chill down his spine. Someone, or something, had left a message here, and Marcus was determined to figure out what it meant.